else you people come from? It's good to see you. Welcome to North Shore. I'm glad you're here. Wolfgang, and if you are new at North Shore, we want to especially welcome you and thank you for being here today. It's great to have you as sort of the fall is kicking back into full swing. Whether I see many of you excited about kickoff for the football season and school starting and all those kinds of things. So we are very glad to have you here. It's an honor to get to talk a little today. I want to start by telling you a story. Maybe you heard about this. There was a business guy who actually last year had one of the best years of business he had ever had. And when he started the year, it was actually a fairly small operation, just kind of a mom and pop thing. But then things began to explode with growth. And by the end of the first quarter, it became very clear that he needed to hire some new people on. And so he went out and did just that. He had a core team that he started with, but he added a few new employees, and yet things continued to grow. Midway through the year, they realized, my goodness, we're still understaffed. I need to go out and hire some more. So sure enough, he puts the help wanted sign out and brings some more people onto the team. As he gets closer to back to school season, sure enough again, business grows. He needs more people, hires on a whole new crop of employees. And by this time, the business is getting quite large. And as he's nearing year end, that's not easy to say, he realizes to handle the holiday rush that they're going to experience, he needs to bring even more people on. And so what started out as a pretty small operation at the beginning of the year, at the end of the year, has turned into a good-sized company. What's interesting, though, is this guy did something as successful as he was that was incredibly unexpected and so controversial that it created a buzz throughout the community. At the beginning of the year, it was time to send out the W-2s, some tax stuff. And so he puts the W-2s together and he gets them ready to mail. And he asked one of his longtime employees, one of his core guys that had started out the year with him, he says, I need you to do me a favor. I got to get these in the mail. Would you mind taking them down to the post office? No problem, boss, no problem. So he grabs the W-2s, he carries them out to his car, and as he lays them on the seat next to him on the way to the mail, to the post office, he realizes that every one of these W-2 envelopes is unsealed. They're open. Now, what would you do? Would curiosity get the best of you? Just a peek, right? No one's going to know. Well, that's exactly what this guy does. And he knows how much he made this last year. He didn't even need to look at his. This boss is a generous guy. He's paid $100,000 for his services over the year. Great company. And he looks for his buddy's W-2, just curious what his friend makes. He pulls it out. They've been hired around the same time, and he looks, sure enough, exact same amount, $100,000. And he thinks to himself, well, I'm actually a much better employee than he is, but we were hired the same time. I get it. It's no problem. And then as he's leafing through these, he sees a name that he doesn't care for all that much. It's a guy who was added on midway through the year, and for whatever reason, they just didn't hit it off, and the curiosity was killing him. So he pulls out the W-2 only to discover, behold, last year he had been paid $100,000 as well. He only worked there half the year. By this point, his blood's beginning to boil. He sees another one. This guy had been brought on in the fall during that other big series of hires that they'd made, opens it up, wouldn't you know, $100,000. He starts to rifle through all of these, from the people at the very beginning of the year, all the way through the folks who were just seasonal help who worked there for 1 month at the end of the year. Every single one of those employees had been paid $100,000, and he was incensed. He rushed back into the building, stormed into his boss's office. He'd already left for the day. So he jumped back in the car, literally drove to his boss's house and pounded on the door. When the boss finally answered the door, no sooner had he cracked it open than this guy unloaded on him. What in the world are you thinking? I know I shouldn't have looked at these, but I can't believe what you did. How could you mistreat your employees like this? He goes off. How could you rip them off? What kind of unfairness in this? I thought you were generous. What kind of a person are you? And once the guy had finished yelling and gotten most of it off his chest, the boss just sort of absorbed it. And he replied very calmly, friend, how have I been unfair to you? Didn't we agree when I hired you that I would pay you $100,000? Take your pay and go home. I decided I wanted to pay the guys we hired at the end of the year the same I paid you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my money? Or are you jealous because I'm generous? Now what do you think of that businessman? You're wondering if he's hiring for seasonal help? Maybe that's what you're wondering, right? Where do I apply, right? Guy sounds nuts. You can't run a business like this. Everybody knows that's not how it works. Depending on who you are, longtime employee, how could he rip us off like that? Short-term employee, this guy's unbelievable. But that's not the way it's supposed to work. You're supposed to be paid what you deserve. Everybody knows that. If you work longer, you work harder, you deserve extra, right? And if you slip in last minute, you don't deserve to be paid like you worked a whole year. But this businessman does things differently. His pay scale isn't based on the quality of the work or even the duration of their employment. This guy's pay scale is based purely on the goodness and the generosity of his own heart. Now, this may seem like an unbelievable story, but to some of you it sounds familiar, right? Because if you know anything about the stories that Jesus told, that's one of his stories. It's slightly modernized a bit in our terms. It's generally known as the parable of the workers in the vineyard. I prefer to think of it as the parable of the generous boss. And it's told for us in Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. And I just kind of want to walk through that together this morning. If you have a Bible, you might want to turn over there because we're just going to kind of walk through this verse by verse, see what we can learn from this. If you don't have a Bible, I would love nothing more than to give you one. So after the service, I'll be hanging out over here in the corner. If you need a copy, come over. We've got a couple different kinds. I'll even show you how to get started reading it. We'd love to give you a Bible, okay? But if you have a Bible, turn to Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 through 16. This story is shocking. It's shocking when we think about it in our world. It was shocking when it was originally told by Jesus way back when. And this is what he said in Matthew chapter 20, starting in verse 1. Jesus speaking, he says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire for his vineyard." This guy's a farmer, grape farmer. And maybe it's harvest time, so he goes down to the local Home Depot to find some guys there who are looking for work. And they've got tools in hand. They need to support their families somehow. And so they're looking for work. Verse 2, he agreed to pay them a denarius, which would be a customary day's wage, a good wage, a denarius for the day, and sent them into his vineyard. So these guys make a deal. They have a contract, a day's work for a set amount of pay. And does anybody know what the average work day was, kind of back in that day, what the expectation was? 12 hours. 12 hours. The day would start at 6 a.m., and typically a work day would go until 6 p.m. Apparently they didn't have very good unions there at the Grape Pickers of America, or whatever that was, right? So that's when things would have started, 6 a.m. Some translations go on. They say about at the third hour, which would be the third hour of work, or 9 in the morning is the translation we're using. 9 in the morning, he, the master, went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. Verse 4, he told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." A different word there. You notice, there's clear expectation with this first group, what they're going to be paid, a denarius, a day's wage. But what does the landowner offer here? What does he say? "I'll pay you whatever's right," he says. How much is that? They don't know. You have to ask yourself, how many of us would actually take a job under these conditions? You agree to give so many hours per week to perform certain tasks, then in your contract, under the salary category, it just reads, "Whatever my employer thinks is right." How many of you are signing up for that job? Is that one you're going to take? I don't know, maybe. To work under those conditions, you'd have to have a high degree of trust in the one who's doing the paying, right? Because you're banking everything on his generosity, and that's exactly what they did. They said, "We'll sign on with you based purely on trust. We believe you'll treat us right." So the master goes back, and then he goes back again a few times to the marketplace. Verse 5, so they went, these that accepted. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. Now verse 6, about 5 in the afternoon, which remember, how much time is left for work that day? 1 hour, that's all that's left. 1 hour. He went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" "Because no one hired us," they answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." And then they reached the end of the workday. Verse 8. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first." It's pay time. And this is where the story really turns. Scandalous. Even makes you a little mad, doesn't it? If the owner's hiring practices are a little unusual, it's nothing compared to his compensation package, right? I mean, there's quite the human resource department at this vineyard, apparently. Verse 9, the workers who were hired about 5 p.m. came and each received a denarius, a full day's wage. They'd only worked 1 hour. They get 12 times what they deserved. And this would mean, of course, that they'd have enough to feed their families because that's what they needed to survive. And you have to imagine what had to have been going through their minds on the way home from work that day. He said he would pay us what's right, but I never dreamed he'd do this. I wonder if somebody in payroll messed up. I mean, let's get out of here before he realizes what happened, right? So they rush home. And this scene gets repeated. Everybody gets paid until all that's left, it appears, are the guys who put in the full 12. Verse 10. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. They'd seen these paychecks be passed out. But each one of them received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day?" But he answered one of them, "I'm not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same I gave you. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my money? Or are you envious because I'm generous?" And then Jesus explains, "The last will be first, and the first shall be last." Now, before any of you take this back to work tomorrow and demand that we begin biblical compensation practices around here, that's not the point at all of the story, so don't get hung up on that, all right? This story, of course, is trying to teach us something. It's trying to reveal something about God, about us. Specifically, when it comes to God, what's it tell us? I mean, what picture comes to your mind when you think of God? People have all sorts of pictures. I heard about a little girl who one day was sitting in class and coloring, drawing feverishly, and a teacher came by and said, "Sweetheart, what are you drawing?" And she explained, "I'm drawing a picture of God." And the teacher very kindly said, "Oh, honey, nobody knows exactly what God looks like." And the little girl responded, "Well, they will when I'm done." And she knew. We think we know. We just think we know. We all have this image in our mind of what God is like. But sometimes these pictures, wherever we get them from, sometimes they're actually quite different from the pictures we see painted in the Bible. Specifically in many of the parables. And this summer, we've been looking at some of those pictures. Remember, we talked early this summer, those of you who might have been here, we talked about this guy throwing a massive party. So excited about this celebration, he wants every seat filled. He invites anyone who will come. And of course, that teaches us about this incredible, generous, celebratory heart of God who wants people to be part of his celebration and extends that invitation to everyone. Another week, we talked about this loving picture of a dad whose heart was broken by his wayward child, but who is compassionately, patiently waiting to welcome him home and embrace him once again as his child. Teaching us, of course, that this God, no matter where we've been or how far we've gone, he's so eager to say, "Come on home." Story after story after story that paints a picture of God that may be very different from what most people think. And it's the same thing here. Jesus is painting this picture of God who is inviting people to come to him, who's saying, no matter what you've been or how long you've been away, come now. Don't wait anymore. Come now. To be part of my forgiveness, he says, to be part of my movement, part of my kingdom, part of my work. Come be part of what I'm doing. Who's eligible? Who can come? Who can apply? Who gets to go to the vineyard? Who gets to be part of his care? Who gets to be on the receiving end of his generosity? Jesus answers, anybody. Anybody at all. And that's what happened back then. All kinds of people were coming to him. People everybody else thought shouldn't be near someone like Jesus, this good rabbi. And yet the people everybody else looked down on, the sketchy types, the checkered past types, people that were prostitutes and tax collectors, people who'd been rejected and shunned spiritually as not being worthy. These people couldn't get enough of Jesus. They came running to him. And Jesus, and then his early followers, they welcomed him. And Jesus says, you can come right into the kingdom. I want to give you a whole new start. You get a whole denarius. You're not made assistant disciples or put on some kind of spiritual probation for a while first. You're not assigned to the JV team. I'm going to put you right on varsity right out of the gate. And that's the good news, friends. That's the essence and core of why we're even here, is to bring this message to people who think you've got to earn it. You've got to do it on your own. You've got to find a way to solve these problems. The good news is that no matter who you are or where you've been, whether you've done the right thing or the wrong thing, whether you've been doing God's thing or been doing your own thing, however long it's been, through Jesus, you have a chance to be part of something new. An entirely new start. That's the good news. And I know in a room this size, there's people in this room who need to open up to that today. Who need to see the real picture of who God is, not as some angry judge who's just waiting for you to step out of line so he can zap you, but who instead has gone out of his way to open the door so you can come home. Come home. To anyone who will say, God, I need a fresh start. I need what you have to offer. And I know I'm late to the game. I know I should have been working all day. Whatever that might look like, I'm ready now. I need what you offer. I admit my failures. I'm asking for your grace. I need a new start, God. To have those failures forgiven, taken care of once and for all through what Jesus did on the cross. And then to learn to live this new life, to go a new direction and discover what your kind of living looks like. And maybe today's that day for you. Maybe that's the reason you're here today. Because today's that day when you make that mark on that card, or you come talk to me after the service and we pray together and talk about where we go from here. You just come right in. The door is wide open. But of course, there were others in Jesus' day who had kind of a problem with that. Kind of the religious leader types. Those who had behaved themselves. For the purposes of this story, they'd been working in the vineyard for a long time. The Bible calls them people like scribes or Pharisees, religious guys who'd been in that vineyard a long time. And they are not happy to see these latecomers getting a reward. Because they kind of resent this whole deal. They resent God. They resent grace. To tell you the truth, they kind of resent their lives. All these rules that they struggle so hard to follow just so they can make sure everyone thinks they have it all together. So Jesus tells this story, which of course is really not only about this amazing landowner, but about two kinds of people. And by doing it, he tells us something about each of us. Because there's many of us in this room who do know Jesus, who have opened themselves up to that fresh start, that amazing grace. And part of what this story is about is challenging how will our life play out? How will we interact with people? How will we respond to others who are still struggling in different ways? And it basically breaks down this way. On one hand, you can practice what for the purposes of this talk we'll call resume Christianity. Resume Christianity, where your whole life is all about building up a list of improvements and strengths and achievements. A resume is something you put together to try to impress someone, to earn their respect. It's sort of a performance-based Christianity. And there are people who live as if they're in a wage-earning relationship with God. These people are very often critical of things. And it's especially dangerous for those of us who've been around church stuff long enough and for any period of time. Because what begins to happen after you begin to accumulate years of breaking habits and being sacrificial and serving and giving and loving and growing in your faithfulness, after a while, we don't set out to do this, and we don't even really articulate it this way, but deep down inside, we start to think, you know what? I'm really not all that bad. When it comes to people hard to love, I'm pretty easy. I mean, look at how much good I've done. And we start to do things just to show God, to show others how good we've become. It's resume or performance-based Christianity. And what begins to happen is this sort of living, instead of growing us in joy and graciousness and compassion and generosity, our lives become choked off. They devolve into grumbling and arrogance and resentment. And I know that this can happen because for a long time, this was the brand of Christianity that I lived. There was a time when being a Christian was all about performing. It was all about impressing people with how much better I was than everybody else. It's about following the rules and then feeling better than those who didn't follow the rules, keeping up appearances, not doing some of the bad things I knew other people were doing. And I'm ashamed to admit it, but I subtly began to think that I was better than all those other people. It creeps in if you're not careful. I still had my struggles, of course, but I'd gotten good at hiding those. And I took comfort in the fact that at least my sins weren't as bad as all those people's sins, whoever those people might be. But friends, I was so proud, so arrogant, so eager to show everybody else how godly I was. I told many of you this story before, but it's such a perfect snapshot of it. I remember when I was a teenager, I was going to this Christian camp. And I remember one summer there was this big contest among the campers to see who could memorize the most verses of the Bible. And you'd get points based on how many verses you could memorize. And I don't remember what the prize was. I don't even care, quite frankly. But I remember that I had set out to win this contest. I was going to show everyone else how good I was. Well, as this week of camp went on, it became evident real quick that this contest was going to come down to me and one other girl. And honestly, I do not remember her name, but I can picture her face as I stand before you right now, all right? With her red hair. Basically, this girl and I had blown the rest of the campers away, okay? We were just advanced spiritually. What can you say? It's just the way it was. And during the last day of camp, in the final hours of this contest, it became clear that she was going to beat me. She'd pulled ahead. And I couldn't get her out of my mind. Other kids are out enjoying camp. They're swimming in the pool. They're playing softball. They're making out in the woods, all the stuff you do at church camp, right? But not me. Not me. I kind of obsessed over all this. Why? Because she was in the way of between me and winning this contest. And so I thought to myself, what am I going to do about this little girl? So I killed her. At least in my heart I did. In my heart I did. I hate her, right? Because you see, spiritual life for me had been all about proving that I was the best and I was the smartest and I was so good. I had to perform. And so how ironic is it, as I'm memorizing verses about love and grace and selflessness, I'm filled with hatred and anger and bitterness, right? It killed love. It actually killed the work of God in my life. But of course, I didn't see that back then. I just wanted to win. And this is so easy to slip into, friends, especially the longer we've done this. Sometimes we don't even know it. But we've got to watch our hearts. Watch the signs. Because I saw some of this in me, and I see it in these guys in this story. What's one of those signs? Complaining. Grumbling. Just like the guys in the story. You look again at verse 11, right? It's payday. They get the wage they're expecting. How do they respond? Are they grateful for a good wage? No. Verse 11, when they receive it, they begin to grumble against the landowner. Lots of people spend lots of time grumbling. And when this sets in, there develops this sort of chronic negativity. Nothing's ever good enough. This negativity about their work, about their spouse, about their kids, about the world, about the church. Nothing is good enough. Nothing is the way it should be. And these kinds of folks, when they're on this channel, they don't tend to want to gather with other grace-filled, gratitude-filled people. Oh no, they look for other grumblers so they can all grumble together. And there's this critical spirit that begins to set in. It's not to say that we can't disagree. Of course we disagree. But there's this entitlement, this grumbling that I saw in my own life. And this sort of arrogance, a sort of I'm better than all those people out there. I mean, look at what they openly say in verse 12. Those who were hired last worked only an hour, they said, and you have made them what? Equal. They're not equal. We're better, he says. Why? He goes on, kind of lays it on thick. We have borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day. Look how much better we are than them. There's this spirit of superiority. I'm working harder than other people. I'm sacrificing more. And we don't come right out and say it, but deep down, we see people who struggle in ways that we might not struggle, who do things that we might not do, who say things and act in ways we may not say or act, and we start to think the reason is because we're just better. Or there can be a kind of resentment, a bitterness. Look again at verse 15. How do they respond to the generosity of the master? He challenges them on it. He says, don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I'm generous? He says. See, the owners, they resented, or the workers resented this owner for his generosity. And they get caught in this cycle of comparison. Why don't I get what I deserve? Why am I over here trying to do the right thing and struggling when it seems some of those folks don't give a rip about God and they have all they need? We start comparing. Why don't I have what they have? Why don't I have the spouse she has? Why don't I have the life he has? Why am I sick? Why am I hurting? And they seem to not have a care in the world. It all seems so unfair. I've never met anybody who actually sets out to start to think these things, but I've met so many, including looking back in my own experience, where this just sort of creeps in over time. And when it does, this grumbling, this arrogance, this resentment, it begins to drown joy and generosity and compassion. Our hearts get harder and more bitter. And this is what can come from a sort of performance-based Christianity. Let me just ask you, do you see any of this in your heart? I got to watch it in mine. But there's another way. Instead of some performance-based deal, there's another way that I want to call today thank you note Christianity. See, of course, the difference between a resume and a thank you note is massive, isn't it? Because a resume, I'm trying to brush it all up to look as good as I possibly can. A thank you note, that's something altogether different. That's an expression of gratitude. That's an acknowledgement of a gift. This isn't performance-based Christianity. This is grace-based Christianity. When we see it in the latecomers in this story, right? They have no contract. They're desperate and they know it. And their relationship with God is based purely on trust. They're trusting that this vineyard owner will be generous. And of course, they're rewarded for that. They receive completely unexpected, unearned grace from this guy. And they accept that gift with gratitude. I mean, they have been given a gift not based on their goodness, but on the goodness of that landowner. It's grace. And when you recognized that what you've received isn't something you've earned, but something that has been given to you as a gloriously unfair gift, then you receive that gift with gratitude, with kindness, with generosity. Your life becomes a thank you note. And instead of grumbling, your life is instead marked by gratitude. Not that everything's always perfect, but you're looking for the places of blessing. You're focused on the ways you see God moving and helping and healing. Things aren't perfect, but I have so many things to be thankful for. And I'm going to let my mind dwell on them instead of all the things that I'm mad about. Instead of arrogance, life is marked by a sort of humility and kindness. My struggles may not be the same as yours, but I know what it is to struggle. And at the end of the day, I need grace just as much, maybe more than anybody else. And instead of resentment, there's a sense of compassion and generosity. I'm not holding this against you. I can celebrate with those who celebrate, and I can mourn with those who mourn. Because when those of us who've been touched by God's amazing grace, when we are reminded that we're the ones who've been given gifts when what we deserved was judgment. We're the ones who've been shown mercy when what we deserved was punishment. This is what we believe as followers of Jesus. Then we begin to take this gift of grace and extend it to others. We're reminded we're the lucky ones. No matter how long we've been Christians or what service we've given, we're recipients of a gift that we could never earn for ourselves. And we begin to love and serve and give in different ways. When crisis strikes, whether it's in the life of a friend, whether it's the things we're seeing on the news, whether it's the needs around our planet, instead of thinking to ourselves, I'm so glad that's not me, our first instinct is to say, what can I do to help? How can I step up? What can I give? What can I do? Not to try to impress God or to earn his favor or to score points so later I can cash him in when I want something, but as an expression of profound gratitude for the generous grace that he's given us. You see, here's what I think, and what I've seen, is that even the most hardened skeptic, even the most bitter cynic, when they see that kind of uncommon joy and gratitude and humility and kindness and compassion and generosity, I think even the most bitter cynic can't help but take notice and can't help but wonder, even if I don't believe what you believe, I want to know more about the way you live. Maybe there's something to this, because of course the good news is there is. And this story reminds us. Because ultimately, this story isn't just about whiny workers or lucky latecomers. This story is about the gracious character of the master of the vineyard. This story is about a God who goes back to the marketplace again and again and again. The master of the vineyard who goes back over and over and over. He even comes at the 11th hour. He's going to get hardly any return on his investment, right? He's going to lose a full day's wages. And all the other vineyard owners would laugh at him. Keep that up, you'll go broke. There's no way. That's not how you run a business, they'd say. It's going to cost you everything you have. And of course, they're right, because it did cost him everything. When he gave his son, Jesus, when he allowed him to go to a cross for latecomers like me and you. But the master of this vineyard, he can't stop hoping. Maybe there's another one that will respond. He says to himself, maybe there's one more human being who's out there alone at the end of the day, who's finally at the point where they realize they can't do this on their own, that if they'll just come to me, they can be part of my family, part of my movement, part of my life. Maybe, if I go back again, maybe they'll trust me. Maybe they'll come home. And if they do, I will bring them home. I will give them a place in my vineyard where they belong. And when payday comes around, I will give them the full measure of my grace. And then I'll delight in seeing the look on their face when I do it. See, friends, any reasonable vineyard owner would have gone home a long time ago, said, enough is enough. If you're not working by this point, your chance is past. But still he comes, looking, hoping for just one more. And so for those who don't know him, let me just ask you today, could this be the day when you start to trust him? Even if you're not sure what all it looks like, if you at least know enough that you're willing to bet on the generosity of this God, the grace of this God. And then for those of us who do know him, friends, he's invited us to help with the search. We get to be part of that work, bringing this good news to people who desperately need it. That's what this church is all about. And so we will continue to challenge each other never to give in to this temptation of performance-based resume Christianity. We will be people overwhelmed and humbled and filled and fueled by grace. We'll keep noticing grace and keep basking in God's love and keep extending it to anyone we can find. We'll keep going back to that marketplace again and again for just one more, just like our Master would have us do. Friends, that's what we're all about. Just one more. Who else needs to know? Just bow your head with me. Let's pray about this. Oh, God. This story is scandalous. I was talking about it with a friend of mine just this morning. We kind of get it that these guys are a little angry, a little bugged, because that's our natural tendency. To feel like somehow because we've been in longer or because we've done more, that somehow we deserve more. And in this world, maybe it works that way, God, but you have a beautifully upside down economy. And while many people accuse you of being unfair, this is the truest but most beautiful form of unfairness, that instead of giving us what we do deserve, you give us grace, whether we walk with you for a long time or whether we come to you at the 11th hour. And so, Lord, I stand as one who needs that grace. And I challenge anybody else in this room to acknowledge that need, to invite that in, to say, God, I admit the struggles in my life, the failures. I need that forgiveness. I need a new life. Show me your way. That's you. I'd love to talk to you after service today. Come down and see me in the corner. But for the rest of us, Lord, who've embraced this grace, who've accepted it into our lives, Lord, would you please protect us from any sense of grumbling or arrogance or resentment. Keep our hearts clean and free so that we can freely give this beautiful gift that's been given to us. To celebrate with you over your generosity instead of become bitter because we think we deserve better. Set us free, God, and through that show this world you are real and that your grace is the most powerful force in the world. We lay ourselves before you, and we thank you in the name of the great grace giver himself, Jesus Christ. Amen. Amen.